A Lakota chef published every indigenous ingredient he could name. One thing was missing, and it split a community in half. The absence was not an accident. It was an argument. The missing item, a fry bread recipe, and the argument it started has no clean ending. Sean Sherman is Oglala Lakota, born on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. He grew up eating what his community ate, which included fry bread. By 2017, he had become one of the most prominent indigenous chefs in the country. His cookbook, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, was published by the University of Minnesota Press. It contained wild rice soup, cedar-braised bison, and preparations using pre-contact Lakota ingredients. It contained 0 fry bread recipes deliberately, publicly, and with stated reasons. Within weeks, indigenous food communities across the country were arguing about what that empty space meant. To understand why the argument matters, you need to understand what fry bread actually is. It is white flour, lard, salt, baking powder, and water shaped and fried in oil or fat. The result is golden brown, slightly crisp on the outside, soft and hot in the center. It smells like heat and fat, and something almost sweet. For hundreds of thousands of indigenous people, that smell is the smell of a grandmother's kitchen. And that is exactly where the argument begins. Fry bread is approximately 160 years old. It was born from U.S. government ration kits issued to interned Dene people at Bosque Redondo in 1864. Those rations contained white flour, lard, and baking powder ingredients, with no precedent in pre-contact Dene cooking. Dene women transformed hostile, unfamiliar supplies into something edible and eventually beloved. That origin story is not in dispute. Both sides of this debate agree on the history. What they disagree on is what the history means and what should follow from it. Sherman's argument, stated plainly, is a nutritional and political one. White flour, lard, and processed sugar are not pre-contact Lakota, Dene, or most other nations' foods. Their adoption under duress has produced measurable, generational health consequences in Native communities. Type 2 diabetes rates in Native communities run at approximately twice the national average. To put a scale on that, approximately 2,000 excess cases per 100,000 people. Sherman argues that continuing to cook with commodity ingredients encodes colonial harm into the body. Fry bread connects us to our past, he has said in multiple interviews. But it's important to ask, what does that connection actually mean to us, about what was done to us, or about who we were before? That question does not ask you to forget. It asks you to choose. The empty page where fry bread should be. Sherman's critics within indigenous communities did not dismiss that question. They answered it, and their answer is equally coherent. Ojibwe food writer and activist Winona LaDuke has articulated what might be called the sovereignty of adaptation argument. The Dene women at Bosque Redondo were not absorbing defeat. They were practicing agency. They were handed an alien ingredient and made it into sustenance, culture, and continuity. That act of transformation, the argument goes, is exactly what indigenous ingenuity looks like under pressure. Erasing fry bread from the table does not erase the rations. It erases the women who survive them. This is the core of the Steelman case for fry bread, and it deserves to be heard in full. Survival adaptation is not the same as surrender. When Dene families carried fry bread knowledge home after the 1868 Treaty of Bosque Redondo, they were not carrying defeat. They were carrying something that had kept them alive and that now carried their hands, their kitchens, their mothers. The food had become theirs not because the government gave it, but because their people transformed it. Ownership does not require origin. It requires making. The case for fry bread is not sentimental. It is grounded in how memory actually works. For many Dene and Lakota families, the specific smell of hot lard in a cast iron pan is a form of knowledge. It is the knowledge of who loved you and how they showed it. The golden brown color, the slight resistance under fingers pressing dough, the heat rising from the pan, these are not aesthetics. They are what researchers call embodied memory, knowledge stored in the body, not just the brain. No pre-contact grain reconstruction carries that specific information. And the loss of that information, the counter-argument holds, is its own form of colonial damage. The grandmother is not a recipe. She is a person. This is where the debate gets structurally interesting for anyone who thinks about political philosophy. Both arguments are making claims about sovereignty, they just locate it differently. Sherman locates sovereignty in the body, the right of indigenous people to reclaim pre-contact nutrition and resist colonial food systems. His critics locate sovereignty in community memory, the right of indigenous people to define their own cultural continuity, including its painful chapters. Neither of these is a bad argument. They are not even contradictory arguments. They are arguments about which kind of sovereignty takes precedence when the two are in tension. Political philosophy does not have a clean answer to that. Neither does this documentary. But what came next? The South Dakota chapter. Nobody in the lower 48 fully processed. In 2005, the South Dakota state legislature voted to make fry bread the official state bread. South Dakota is built on lands that include the homelands of multiple Lakota nations. The food it was claiming as its state symbol was born from the forced removal of those very nations. The indigenous responses did not arrive as a unified chorus. They arrived as three distinct arguments. The first, naming fry bread as state bread, romanticizes a symbol of forced removal and erases its trauma. The second, the designation at least acknowledges visible, ongoing Native presence in the state, which is not nothing. The third, a settler government has no legitimate claim to define or celebrate a survival food that belongs to the people who survived. All three of those arguments are correct at the same time. One state legislature vote became a flashpoint, touching approximately 7,400,000 people of American Indian and Alaska Native ancestry nationwide. That is more people than live in Washington state, and not one of them got a vote on the bread. Let's hold on that number for a moment. 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. That is more sovereign nations than there are countries in the entire European Union, which has 27. The fry bread debate does not speak for all 574 equally. The debate is sharpest in Dene and Lakota communities, the nations with the most direct historical relationship to the 1864 ration system. But the conversation has expanded because nearly every one of those nations had their food systems disrupted by commodity rations, boarding schools, and reservation confinement. The specific dish varies. The structural wound does not. The USDA Commodity Foods Program is the direct institutional descendant of the Bosque Redondo ration system. As of 2024, it still distributes white flour, lard, canned goods, and processed cheese to qualifying tribal households. The program is called the Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations. The ingredients have barely changed in 160 years, which means the conditions Sherman is arguing against are not historical. Next week, a delivery truck will arrive. The argument is not about the past, it is about Tuesday. Here is where the evidence becomes harder to dismiss from either direction. If the FDPIR still distributes the same category of commodities as the 1864 ration kit, then fry bread is not a historical artifact. It is a contemporary product of a contemporary government program. Sherman's nutritional argument does not point backward. It points at a live policy decision that can be changed. That is a different kind of claim than nostalgia. That is a public health argument with a named institutional address. At the same time, the families making fry bread this week are not making it because they lost. They are making it because it is Saturday, and that is what Saturday smells like in their house. And telling them those are the same thing is not a nutritional intervention. It is a judgment about someone else's kitchen. The debate splits along at least two distinct axes that political thinkers will recognize immediately. Axis 1 is what we might call the forward question. What do we eat to be healthier and more sovereign starting now? Axis 2 is the backward question. What do we honor because it carried our people through conditions that should never have existed? These are not the same question. Treating them as the same question is how the debate collapses into false binaries. Sherman's book is operating primarily on Axis 1. His critics are operating primarily on Axis 2. Neither axis is illegitimate. Neither cancels the other. Brian Yazzie is Dene, a chef, and someone who has thought publicly about this exact tension. He has stated in interviews that the debate itself is healthy, that Dene and Lakota communities questioning their own food systems is an exercise of sovereignty. The distinction matters. Division implies fracture. Sovereignty implies an active, ongoing, self-governing argument about what you value and why. A community that cannot argue about its own food has already lost something more important than the food. Crystal Wapapa is Kickapoo Nation, a James Beard Foundation semi-finalist, and the owner of Wapapa's Kitchen in Oakland, California. Her menu does not resolve the debate, it refuses to. She serves pre-contact ingredients alongside community-beloved dishes not as a compromise, but as a statement about coexistence. Her position is that the choice between pre-contact food and survival food is a false choice. A community can honor both. A table can hold both. A menu can hold both. What it cannot hold is a policy that makes the choice for you by delivering the same commodities your great-grandmother had no choice about. The most revealing part of this story lives in a metaphor. Consider what a scar is. A scar is absolutely part of your body. It came from your lived experience. It is real and it is yours. But that does not mean you wanted it. And choosing not to show it does not mean it did not happen. Fry bread, in this framework, is a scar. Sherman is not denying the scar exists. He is asking whether celebrating the scar is the same as healing from the wound. His critics are not denying the wound. They are asking who gave you the right to tell them how to wear their own body. Both questions are serious. Both deserve answers that neither side has fully provided. Let's go back to the specific texture of the disagreement, because the sensory detail matters here. Sherman's pre-contact menu is not a deprivation diet, it is a return to abundance. Wild rice, cedar, bison, pine nuts, sumac, wojape, these are not austerity foods. They are complex, rich, and deeply specific to the Great Plains and the northern woodlands. The argument is not that fry bread tastes good and pre-contact food tastes bad. The argument is about what the ingredients encode, which history, which body, which future. The warm, almost yeasty smell of fry bread dough before it hits the fat. The sizzle when it makes contact immediate, loud, then settling into a lower hiss. The way the edges turn first, pulling color from gold to brown, while the center stays pale and soft. These are not neutral sensory facts. They are attached to specific people in specific kitchens. That attachment is what makes Sherman's omission feel, to some, like an erasure. Not of a recipe, of a person. You cannot put a grandmother in a cookbook, but you can leave her out of one. There is a concept in political theory called adaptive preferences. It describes how people can come to prefer conditions that were originally imposed on them, and how those preferences become genuinely their own over time. The adaptive preference debate asks, is a preference formed under constraint still authentic? Sherman's implicit answer is, sometimes no, and when the constraint is causing ongoing harm, the preference deserves scrutiny. His critic's implicit answer is, authenticity is not determined by origin, it is determined by ownership over time. Neither of those answers is philosophically naive. This is a real debate in political theory, not just food culture. Fry bread just happens to be where Dene and Lakota communities are having it on their own terms. And having it on their own terms is the key point that outside observers most often miss. This is not a debate between Indigenous communities and the U.S. government. This is not a debate between Indigenous communities and nutritionists. This is an internal argument. Lakota, Dene, Ojibwe, Kickapoo, hundreds of sovereign nations about what they owe their past and what they owe their future. That kind of internal argument is a sign of a living political community, not a wounded one. Dead communities do not argue about their own food, they simply eat what they are given. In 2021, Sherman opened the Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis. It is a training and advocacy center for Indigenous chefs working with pre-contact ingredients. Fry bread is not on the curriculum. The lab is not a government program. It is not a university mandate. It is a voluntary community of practice, built around a specific answer to a specific question about food sovereignty. Sherman is not telling anyone what to cook at home. He is building an institution around what he believes should be cooked professionally. That distinction is important and often lost in the reaction to his work. The reaction when it came, was not one thing. Some Indigenous readers wrote that the cookbook gave them language for something they had felt but not articulated. That eating fry bread at every meal felt, in their own body, like something they had not chosen. Others wrote that the cookbook felt like a judgment on their grandmother's table, that the implicit message, "Stop eating this," landed as "Stop honoring this." Both reactions are about the same book. Both are sincere. Both are about something larger than food. The reaction also exposed a class dimension that rarely gets discussed directly. Pre-contact ingredient, cooking wild rice, heritage corn, foraged plants, sustainable protein is not cheap or easy to access on a reservation. The FDPIR commodity box is, for many families, not a choice between tradition and health. It is a choice between that box and hunger. Sherman's critics on this point are not wrong. Food sovereignty requires food access, and food access requires economic conditions that do not currently exist everywhere. You cannot decolonize your diet with ingredients you cannot afford or find. That is not a philosophical objection. That is a logistics problem with a policy solution. And here, the two sides of the fry bread debate find a rare point of agreement. Both Sherman and his critics would agree that the commodity food system is the actual problem. The disagreement is tactical. Do you reject the products of that system as an act of resistance, or do you reclaim them as acts of survival? Sherman chooses rejection as resistance. LeDuc and others choose reclamation as resistance. Different tactics, same enemy. In 2019, Joy Harjo, Muskogee Nation, and the first Native American U.S. Poet Laureate, spoke publicly about fry bread's dual identity, trauma food and love food at the same time, not one and then the other. At the same time, holding that duality without collapsing it into one thing is, she has suggested, itself a form of indigenous resilience. The ability to know exactly where a thing came from and still find beauty in it that is not naivety. That is a sophisticated relationship with pain that most political philosophies have not caught up to. Lise Jacola's poem, Fry Bread, written in 1989, contributed to cementing fry bread as a shared comfort food across powwow circuits. It spread through a community that crosses tribal boundaries, a shared identity marker for people who otherwise come from hundreds of distinct nations. That cross-tribal adoption is itself a product of colonial history. Forced relocation and urban Indian communities created shared experiences that did not exist before. Fry bread, in this sense, is not just Dene food or Lakota food. It became a food shared across many nations precisely because colonial policy homogenized survival conditions. Which means the dish that Sherman critiques as colonial is also, paradoxically, evidence of indigenous community building in the face of colonization. The irony does not resolve the debate. It deepens it. A food that proves the harm and proves the survival at the same time. Let us be precise about what Sherman actually did and did not do in 2017. He did not write an essay condemning fry bread. He did not publish a manifesto against families who make it. He wrote a cookbook and left something out. The argument came from the community, from readers who interpreted the omission as a statement, because it was one. What Sherman did was exercise an author's right to define the boundaries of his own work. What the community did was refuse to let those boundaries be the last word. Both of those are acts of sovereignty. The parallel to broader political debates is worth naming for the philosophy-oriented viewer. This is structurally identical to arguments within other communities about which traditions to retain and which to release. Who gets to decide? The intellectual who names the harm? The grandmother who lived through it? The grandchild who inherits both? There is no neutral position in that triangle. Every political community that has experienced collective trauma eventually has this argument. Indigenous communities are having it publicly, with named voices, in cookbooks and food labs and op-eds. That is not a crisis. That is democratic self-governance at the level of culture. The body memory argument deserves its own sustained examination before this documentary ends. When proponents of fry bread say the smell is a grandmother, they are not being imprecise. Olfactory memory is the most direct sensory pathway to autobiographical memory in human neuroscience. The smell of a specific food in a specific kitchen is stored differently in the brain than other memories. It is more immediate, more emotional, less mediated by language. Asking someone to give up that smell is not asking them to change a recipe. It is asking them to do something to their nervous system that they did not agree to. Hot fat in cast iron. The sound before you see, the color change. The weight of the finished piece, heavier than it looks. No ingredient list produces that. A person produces that. And the person is gone, and the recipe is what remains. Sherman's answer to the body memory argument is implicit in his cookbook structure. He fills the space where fry bread would be with different memories or the invitation to build new ones. Wojape, a traditional Lakota berry sauce, has its own smell and texture and transmission. Wild rice has a particular earthy depth, a chew, a color that is almost black before it opens in water. The argument is not that pre-contact food has no sensory identity. The argument is that the sensory identity of pre-contact food was interrupted and can be rebuilt if communities choose to rebuild it. That is an optimistic claim. It may also be a hard one. The hardest version of Sherman's argument is this. The grandmother who made fry bread was herself a product of colonial disruption. Her culinary knowledge, the white flour, the lard, the specific technique was imposed on her before it became hers. Her grandmother cooked something else, with different hands, and that knowledge was severed. What Sherman is pointing to is not the grandmother you remember. It is the grandmother she never got to be. The loss is 2 generations deep, not one. And fry bread, however beloved, cannot make you miss someone you never met. But the hardest version of the counter-argument is equally true. The grandmother you remember is real. The love she put into the food is real. The severed connection to pre-contact cooking is a genuine loss, but it is a loss that happened to someone else, in a time you did not live. The grandmother in your memory is not a consolation prize for a better grandmother you never had. She is your grandmother. Her food is your food. Her hands are in your memory. Telling someone their actual grandmother matters less than a theoretical pre-contact ancestor is not healing. It is a different kind of erasure. Both losses are real. They are not the same loss. Here is where the debate requires a distinction that political philosophy actually has language for. There is a difference between a harm and its consequence. The harm is what the U.S. government did at Bosque Redondo, in the boarding schools, through the commodity food system. The consequence is fry bread and everything attached to it, including the love. Sherman's argument is directed at the harm. His critic's argument is directed at the consequence. They are not arguing about the same thing, which is partly why they talk past each other. Naming that distinction does not resolve the debate, but it makes the debate more precise. Precision matters here, because the stakes are not abstract. As of 2024, the USDA FDPIR truck keeps arriving. The flour keeps coming. The lard keeps coming. The processed goods keep coming. The policy infrastructure that produced fry bread has not changed in any structural way in 160 years. Which means the debate about what to do with those ingredients is not a historical debate. It is a policy debate, dressed in a food debate, dressed in a cultural debate. And the deepest version of food sovereignty, the version both Sherman and his critics actually want, requires changing what arrives on that truck. That is a legislative fight, not a cookbook fight. But cookbooks can start legislative fights. History suggests they can. Brian Yazzie said the debate is healthy. Crystal Wapapa built a menu that holds both truths. Joy Harjo held the duality in language. Sean Sherman held the duality in absence. Winona LaDuke held it in the argument that survival is a form of genius. None of them resolved it. All of them are right about something. And the fact that these voices are named, public, and in disagreement is itself the answer to the question of whether indigenous food culture is alive. It is not a relic. It is an argument in progress. In 2022, Wapepa's Kitchen served a plate that included pre-contact grains and a community-beloved dish side by side. No manifesto, no omission, no hierarchy. Just a plate that said, "We contain multitudes, and we are not required to choose between them for your comfort." That plate is also a political position. Maybe it is the most sophisticated one on offer. The steelman for Sherman stated as clearly as possible, a community that eats what its oppressor designed for it, generation after generation, and calls it tradition, may be confusing survival with preference. Reclaiming pre-contact food is reclaiming a version of yourself that preceded the harm. That is not nostalgia. That is decolonization in the most literal sense, removing the colony from the body. The health data supports the urgency. 2 times the national diabetes rate is not a cultural argument. It is a mortality argument. At that scale, the choice of what to eat is not private. It is public health. And public health can be changed. The steelman for the counter-argument stated as clearly as possible, the people who survived did not survive as abstractions. They survived as specific people with specific kitchens, and specific recipes, and specific love encoded in specific smells. Telling their descendants to eat differently is not the same as telling the oppressor to stop. The oppressor is not in the kitchen. The grandmother is. And a political movement that makes the grandmother the enemy has made a serious tactical and moral error. Sovereignty includes the right to eat your grandmother's food without being told it is false consciousness. Both steelmen are standing. Neither has fallen. This is where a philosophy-oriented viewer might notice a familiar structural pattern. The fry bread debate is formally similar to debates within other historically oppressed communities about assimilation, adaptation, and authenticity. What is ours? What was imposed? Can imposed things become ours? Who decides when they have? These questions do not have universal answers because they are not universal questions. They are answered differently by every community, in every generation, based on conditions that keep changing. The Dene answer in 1868, when fry bread came home from Bosque Redondo, was different from the Dene answer in 2017. Both answers were correct for their moment. The question of which answer is correct for 2024 is still open. And here is the part that ties the whole debate together in a way neither side fully acknowledges. The debate about fry bread is only possible because the people are still here. 574 federally recognized nations. Languages still spoken, ceremonies still performed, kitchens still producing. The argument about fry bread is a luxury that's survival enabled, which means fry bread, whatever else it is evidence that the survival worked. Sherman's critics are not wrong to point to that. Sherman is not wrong to ask what comes next. The Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis is training the next generation of native chefs in pre-contact cooking. Wapapa's Kitchen in Oakland is serving a menu that refuses the binary. Reservation kitchens across the country are making fry bread this weekend, with hands that know exactly how it should feel. These things are happening simultaneously, in the same country, within the same community of 574 sovereign nations. That is not contradiction. That is a living culture working out what it values in real time. The only thing that would be a problem is if the argument stopped. The USDA truck will arrive next week. The flour will be white. The lard will be lard. A family will make something from it, and that something will carry their hands and their history and their love. At the same time, a chef in Minneapolis will be teaching a student to cook with amaranth and sumac and heritage corn. And a chef in Oakland will be writing a menu that puts both traditions on the same plate without ranking them. And a Lakota author's 2017 cookbook will still have an empty page where fry bread would be. And the empty page will still be saying something. It has not finished speaking. The argument is the point. The argument is the sovereignty. Sherman asked whether the connection to the past should be about what was done to us or about who we were before. His critics asked whether anyone outside the kitchen gets to make that call. Wapapa's plate asked whether the question is actually a binary at all. Yazzie asked whether the debate itself is the most indigenous thing happening in food culture right now. Harjo held all of it in the idea that a food can be a trauma and a love simultaneously, and that holding both is not confusion. It is accuracy. None of them are waiting for this documentary to tell them who won. The fry bread debate will not be settled by a cookbook, a food lab, a James Beard nomination, or a South Dakota statute. It will be settled, if it is ever settled, by individual families in individual kitchens, making individual decisions about what they owe their past and their children. 574 nations, millions of kitchens, millions of answers. That is not a problem to be solved. That is sovereignty in practice. The question this documentary leaves you with is not whether fry bread should exist. It is, who has the right to decide what a survival food means and what it costs for the people who survived? If your answer is immediate, you may be missing something. If it makes you uncomfortable, you may be getting somewhere. The people living this debate are not waiting for the discomfort to resolve. They are cooking in it, arguing in it, building institutions in it, writing poems in it, and feeding their children in it. Which is, come to think of it, exactly what sovereignty looks like from the inside. If this debate is new to you, find the sous chef's Indigenous kitchen and read what Sherman built, then read what his critics built in response. A dish born from the worst moment of a people's history became the taste of their survival, and now the survival is strong enough to argue about what it costs. There is no higher proof of life than that.